that we felt was holding Louisiana back.
Right.
We look at states around us like Texas, Florida, Tennessee. All these states are really booming. They're attracting population. And Louisiana, we're losing. I think we lost 80,000 people or so in the last 2 years. So it's been a significant decline. So, we're looking at how do you fix that problem. I mean, you need big solutions to fix these big problems. And so I think tax reform is a big piece of that.
All right, that was Louisiana's Secretary of Revenue, Richard Nelson, and he's here with us in the studio as well, talking about, that was last fall during the special session on taxes. You were talking about needing big solutions to get things done. And certainly one of the big solutions that's appearing before the Louisiana voters now is Amendment 2. And that's going to be on the March 29th ballot. We're going to drop this episode of the podcast real fast so people can see this information. So, first of all, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate this. And just let's go with Amendment 2 and what it does, and then we'll get into the other stuff.
So I said in the fall, as I said in the fall, so eloquently, we really need big solutions to solve Louisiana's problems, right? I like to use the point that we haven't added a congressional seat since 1910, which is we haven't grown faster than the rest of the country since 1910. So There's been a problem for a long time where Louisiana's been losing people. Has been losing businesses, and so we need to do something different. And so I think the governor and the legislature both kind of, embrace this idea that we need to do big things. In that legislative, the special session last November, we passed a whole lot of tax reform things. A lot of that's in effect now. It was all statutory, so it's already the law.
Right.
We cut income taxes. We, cut corporate income tax. We did a bunch of changes, simplify, got rid of a bunch of credits and special interest exemptions and stuff. But this constitutional amendment number 2 is kind of the final piece. And I would say it's foundational because it is in the Constitution. It reforms the revenue and taxation article of the Constitution, which is the longest section. It's actually longer than the original 1974 Constitution, just this
crazy.
One article,
Yeah.
right? I know people, I've gone all over the state, people always complain to me, why do we have to vote on all these amendments? Why do we have to vote on all these amendments?
Yeah.
Well, 80% of all the amendments since 1974 have been to Article 7 of the Constitution. And so we said, let's go through that and really just clean it out because we've had so many, problems in the state for so long.
Mm-hmm.
People have had to vote. It's kind of just this weird Frankenstein of an amendment. So we went through and we said, is it fundamental law? Does it need to be in the Constitution? And we said, well, what's the best policy going forward? And so we made a lot of changes to it. And that all is put on the ballot in one single amendment with one single vote, right? The ballot language kind of explains some of those things. But there is a lot going on, and I would say it's because there's a lot of problems in the state that we have trying to fix.
And it's 115 pages long, right, this Amendment 2. And I guess that's one of the criticisms of it, that it's 115 pages, but when it appears on the ballot, it's about 90 to 91 words. Critics of Amendment 2 are saying you can't possibly distill that into something that makes sense to the voters. It's all flowers and honey, and it doesn't really give some of the other sides of things. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I would point out that then when the 1974 Constitution was adopted, it said, do you support the 1974 Constitution? That's what it said on the ballot. So that doesn't give you, and that rewrote the entire Constitution. So that doesn't give you a lot of notice. So at least we tried to pick the pieces that I think impact people the most, that people care about the most. That's what the legislature did. The Supreme Court just ruled that, it was clear language, it was unbiased language. And so, obviously I agree with that, but I think that that's, now been decided by the court because some people had tried to challenge it. And I think the voters, you can go online and read the whole thing if you want to. It's all online, it's been totally transparent. It was passed by bipartisan supermajorities of both houses of the legislature. So this is not, this is not hiding the ball or there's anything in there. It's really just an opportunity to, I think, make sweeping changes in the state that are long, long overdue.
Now, it takes some of these things that are in this weird Article 7, as you put it, puts it into statute, and the thought behind that is what? It makes things easier for the legislature to appropriate money here and there, and
sure. So there's about 25 constitutional funds currently, and some of these funds tie up money that. Some of the funds actually they don't do anything. They just stuck in the Constitution, and they don't. There's no deposits in, there's no transfers out. It's just frozen there, right?
Yeah.
So We said, well, why do we have these things? It's kind of like
right.
zombie funds.
Right.
And then so some of them are relevant and very important, but they've been in there for a long time. And we said maybe we can use that money. Like, for example, we're going to take $2 billion that's currently in the educational trust funds and use that money to go and pay down the teachers' retirement debt so that we can give the teachers a permanent pay raise. That move saves $300 million a year. So it's a significant benefit.
Wow. Yeah.
And so we've looked at those things and say, well, what's the best policy? And so some of it is, let's take it out of the Constitution. Let's give the legislature more flexibility to change it. Because currently, when it's in the Constitution, if you want to change it, a the to an and or something like that, you have to have a constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
And so, especially the things that have been amended a lot, we said, well, that probably isn't fundamental law if we change it every other week,
Yeah.
And so we said, well, let's put it into statute. We did, especially for the property tax, some of the property tax stuff, we said, hey, no, it's going to need a super majority of both houses to change instead of just a simple majority. So it'll be a 2/3 vote. But we did leave the homestead exemption is still in the Constitution,
Okay.
so that will still be in there. And then also a new exemption for religious organizations, for churches and the clergy housing and educational institutions. That will stay in the Constitution.
That was one of the criticisms, right? That the religious organizations or groups had kind of lost their exemptions or something, and yet you're saying it's there.
Yeah. So there is a very, very broad there's a very, very broad property tax exemption that's for basically every nonprofit and whatever they're doing. So that comes out. It still stays the law. It's going into statute. But we did create, because we were concerned about the churches and religious organizations, we did create a specific one in the Constitution for them.
Well, wonder why they were criticizing it then, since it's in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent people just are afraid of change. I mean, that's part of our problem is that, anytime you do, I mean, even a little change, people kind of are like, wait, what's going on?
Yeah.
And so this is a very big sweeping change. So, I think it's worthy of debate. It's worthy of
Sure.
criticism.
Yeah.
And so we did have significant number of hearings and committee meetings in the legislature to discuss all these things. And it was, it was an adventure. But I think at the end of the day, this is the step we need to move Louisiana forward.
Well, it certainly seems like it frees things up moving forward and allows the lawmakers to take some of that money. Like they were locked in, right? The only thing they could change was healthcare and education.
Yeah.
Now this frees some of that up.
Yeah. So I mean, specifically, we've had.
Or am I wrong about that?
No, you're right. So there's, I mean, besides just the funds that go to pay the teacher debt and free up the teacher pay raise. There's also we have two savings accounts. There's kind of the rainy day fund, which is our normal, hey, we don't have enough money, we need to pull some out of savings. There's the rainy day fund, that's our normal account. And then we have another one that was created that was basically kind of like a savings account for infrastructure. But that is supposed to the money's just supposed to sit there until you get $5 billion in it. And, kind of our point was, we kind of got a lot of infrastructure needs right now. Like I know the I-49 North, Jimmy Davis Bridge, all these things, they cost money. Yeah. And you're like, let's not just wait until this, until these things are available, right? Until you get to $5 billion. And so we changed, that was one of the funds. We basically combined those two funds and said, hey, right now that gets most of our severance and corporate income collections. And we said, let's just send that to the general fund so the legislature can use that to fix the problems that we have now. We'll still have one of the highest balances in our rainy day fund and our real savings account after we combine those funds. But we will have that more freedom going forward to use that money today.
And one of the things you mentioned was the teacher pay raise. In the last few years, teachers have been getting a $2,000 stipend every year. And that makes that permanent. It's one of the criticisms was, well, that's not really a raise. It didn't come through the MFP, I guess.
Yes.
It's just making the stipend permanent. I'm not really sure I follow that logic, because to me that feels like it's a raise, but can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think somewhat of the confusion, I guess, is that if the difference between if I give you $100 once or if I give you $100 every year for the rest of your working career, that's the difference. And so the legislature has twice appropriated money to give them a $2,000 stipend. That's not in the budget this year. They don't have the money to do it this year. And so this is the mechanism where we make this debt payment, and in the interest savings, we basically require them to get a raise up to that $2,000, at least up to that $2,000. But in reality, I think the savings from that debt payment is going to be even greater than that. So the local school systems will have to give them either a raise, or they have a very limited number of uses that they can use the excess money on. And it's like $40 million. So, I mean, it's not going to be a small amount of money. So there is an opportunity for teachers to get an even greater raise than that stipend that they have been getting.
Well, I mean, that all sounds positive. I just wasn't following the logic before.
Yeah, I mean, I think once again, people fear change, and this is a lot of change.
Yeah. So some of the other things, I just wrote a couple of notes down here. This lowers the maximum income tax rate. That's in this amendment too.
That's right. So currently in the Constitution, the maximum income tax rate is 4.75%, and this lowers it down to 3.75%. So currently, based on our tax reform last year, the rate is 3%. So it's actually below that maximum. But that maximum is actually lower than it was than you paid in 2024.
Yeah.
And so the idea was that we didn't want to have it go back up at some point, right? We don't want the legislature to meet and say, hey, look, like we're short of money, let's raise everybody's income taxes. And so that drops it, so it's at 3.75%, so it can't go higher than that.
Going back to last fall, then in the tax session, I guess you guys did a lot of things, and the legislature did a lot of things, obviously with you advising. But one of the criticisms in that was, well, yeah, you did this, you did that, you lowered income tax rates, et cetera, but property or sales tax went up.
Yeah.
I mean, there has to be some sort of a balance, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in tax policy, it's all choices, right? There's no free lunch, right? And so a lot of the money that we raised, we did it through cutting, these kind of special interest tax breaks and deductions and credits and everything that, you had some certain industry that would come and get a credit, or you had some specific people that would get a carve out for them. And so we got rid of a lot of those things. That's how we helped lower the rates. And then some of it was that on the sales tax side, we had proposed taxing like dog grooming and car washes and stuff to try and make up some of the money.
That, yeah.
The legislature didn't want to do that. They would rather, they said, just raise the rate a little bit. And so the rate went from 4.45% in sales tax to 5%. Practically what that means is when you spend $1,000, you're going to spend $5.50 more on tax.
I mean, this is just me, but when I pay that, I mean, I don't even notice that really.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why I guess when they're worried that when people go get their dog groomed, they'd find out they owe tax and it'll be a big deal. And so they'd rather just, kind of spread it out on everything.
I think you mentioned that this amendment 2 increases their double, but basically, is it double the deduction for seniors?
It does, yeah. So it doubles the standard deduction, which so the standard deduction was $4,500, and then the tax reform session we raised it, almost tripled it to $12,500. Yeah. So now if you're over 65, the amendment passes. The first $25,000 that you make will be tax free. And then
I would think that would be a pretty popular point here.
Yeah, I mean, and if say you're a married couple over 65, it's going to be first $50,000, $25,000 per person, right? And then we also doubled the retirement exemption. So if you get IRA withdrawals or 401k, right? We doubled that from $6,000 to $12,000. So if you're a married couple over 65, the first $74,000 of retirement income will be tax free. And then after that, you only pay 3%. So, I mean, that makes Louisiana much more competitive in keeping retirees here and attracting retirees from across the country.
And I wrote down here the government growth limit provision of this amendment. Wasn't there already something in there that limited the...
Yeah.
So now are we, I don't want to say double dipping, but is it a
double prohibition? Yeah. So we had an expenditure limit. So basically it said like, hey, you can collect all this money, but you can't spend more than this. And so what that ended up, I think it wasn't very difficult I think a 2/3 vote, and you just blew it out of the water, which we did a couple times.
Yeah.
But the government growth limit, I think, is stricter, and it really just constrains the general fund. So basically those recurring expenses that the state has, right? So it says you can't grow those recurring expenses more than population and inflation. And it's really just a good government measure to make sure that, the government, lives within its means. We don't just kind of blow it up. That was concern from some of the legislators because they said, hey, look, we think all this tax reform is great. We think it's going to grow the state. We think it's going to result in significantly more tax revenue. And we want that to stay around for basically tax reductions, not just to grow the size of the bureaucracy so that it just kind of promulgates itself.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't pretend to be an expert in any of this stuff, so I'm kind of like a fish out of water trying to ask you questions on this stuff. But this was when you were running for governor a couple of years ago. This was like you got notice for this, right? You're kind of this is right up your alley.
Yeah, so I mean, I really, so I'm an engineer, actually, I'm an engineer by training, so I was kind of look at what's broken and how to fix it and compare it, right? And so I think the tax policy was one of the most broken things in the state, because there really is not a lot of other explanation why Louisiana is ranked last and why we have all these problems when, other states right next to us, like Texas and Florida, are so successful in attracting people.
Yeah.
And I think tax policy made us a big outlier. And so now we've made significant strides. I'm glad, Governor Landry appointed me to let me go do all the things that I talked about, in the legislature and then running for governor too. And I think we've made significant progress, and I think you're going to see the benefits going forward. The state for the next 5 years, especially if constitutional amendment passes, will not be the same. I mean, it will be significantly different. You're going to have, jobs and opportunity like you've never seen before in the state.
How much? Well, I mean, that plays right into my next question. And how much does all of this Amendment 2 play in the business world, not just for the individual citizens, but attracting those businesses into the state?
Sure. So, I mean, I think, some of it was changing the narrative around the state, right? Like Louisiana's backwards. Louisiana never can't get out of its own way. Louisiana has all these old rules we don't understand. So we fixed a lot of those things in that tax reform special session. But at the same time, I think when people are looking for fundamental change, if you're going to invest $10 billion, right, you really want to make sure that things are going to go your way. And I think the constitutional amendment is kind of finalizes that, right? Like shows that Louisiana really is on the right track. We've kind of cast off this ghost of Huey Long that's been haunting us for the last 100 years, and we're ready to really move forward and compete with the other southern states.
What are some of the other, as you travel around the state and you talk to people, what are some of the other criticisms you're getting on Amendment 2? Yeah,
I mean, I think some of it was that it was rushed. Like, this is rushed.
Yeah.
You did it in a 2-week special session.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure there was a lot of planning that went into before you hit that special
But
session.
I mean, that's like, honestly, to me, that's kind of like complaining about a rocket launch. Like, you just did this rocket launch too quick, and you're like, okay, well, we spent years planning on building the rocket and testing it and doing all these things before we launched it. So, I mean, like, to me, it's not really a legitimate criticism. Honestly, most of the text of Article 2, of Amendment 2, a lot of it came from that PAR guide, the Public Affairs Research Council. They did a whole, report on what needs to change in the Constitution. A lot of that we just, almost copied and said, hey, look, we're just going to go with what they said about these things.
You like that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, they did a lot of research. I mean, and that was built on 50 years of other research from, we've had legislative committees, we've had experts that have come in and examined the tax code and stuff. And so all of these changes have been recommended forever. It's just, we finally had the political will to do it. I obviously went around the entire state last year for a year to kind of build support, to get feedback. We made changes to it. We had multiple legislative committee meetings before we even went into session to discuss all these changes. And so I don't know that there's ever been as well orchestrated of a plan to move Louisiana forward as we did for this amendment. So I think that is not really a great criticism.
Well, no, I mean, it's pretty obvious. You don't just show up for the session and all of this stuff magically appears on the table and you vote on it. I mean, obviously, you do a lot of research and a lot of study and a lot of meetings behind the scene and talk and discussion, et cetera, et cetera.
The amendment is 115 pages. Like, basically, my staff, legislative staff, had to write all 115 of those pages. Like, it wasn't just, it didn't just appear. It wasn't ChatGPT, right?
Yeah.
So it really was a Herculean effort. I mean, they all put in a whole lot of work. My staff is great. I couldn't have done it without them. And I think legislative staff, I know, worked really hard because it was a compressed schedule. It was kind of like, it was like the Super Bowl, right? Like, you had to go do it. You had to go on the field. You got an hour. It's the same thing when you have a 2-week special session. So
obviously the next step is the March 29th ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously you're here to urge people to vote yes on that day.
Absolutely.
What if it doesn't pass? Then what?
Yeah, I mean, we have we made a lot of positive changes in statute. If it doesn't pass, I mean, there's really just a lot of negative things that happen. I mean, I think that the fiscal stability of the state will not be that great going forward because you basically didn't create that fiscal flexibility that I think you need going forward. The teachers don't get a pay raise. We basically continue to pay a bunch of money, $300 million a year in interest instead of giving them a pay raise and paying off debt. I think that's negative. The teachers don't get a standard, or the seniors don't get a double standard deduction, so they don't get that extra tax break. I think that's important. And I think one thing we didn't talk about too is we did put a barrier on special interest tax breaks going forward. And I mean, I think that's something that's plagued the state, and that's what we tried to clean up in that tax reform special session. And so that, I think that part of the amendment is also really critical, because we don't want to have to slide back into, hey, everybody's brother and cousin hires a lobbyist and then goes gets a special tax break.
Yeah.
You know, we want everybody to just get a relief by lowering the rates for everyone, right? And so I think there's a lot of negative things that come. I mean, I think Louisiana will still be in a better position than it was a year ago. But I think these fundamental changes, I think, absolutely need to happen.
Did you put some lobbyists out of work with those changes?
You know, honestly, I joked that our tax reform session was really the Lobbyist Employment Act, because we sacrificed so many of those sacred cows and, you know, special interest tax breaks that, you know, they made a whole lot of money. They'll be fine. Hopefully they put it in the bank.
Can you talk about the difference between something being in the Constitution and being in statute, so that people understand the difference?
Yeah, sure. So if it's something is in statute, basically the legislature can change it. Sometimes they can do it with a simple majority, which is relatively easy, you know, or I mean, if you have the votes, if it's it's an okay idea, say you have an okay idea, you can change it with you can convince half of them to vote for it. If it's a 2/3 vote, sometimes it's a 2/3 vote, like a lot of the things we're taking out of the Constitution now in this amendment, we said now it's got to be a 2/3 vote. That's a lot harder, because a 2/3 vote comes down to, you know, sometimes somebody's in the bathroom and the vote fails, right?
Yeah.
So it's a difficult thing to get. And then finally, if it's in the Constitution, you don't, it just 2/3, it requires a 2/3 vote of both houses, and then it goes to a vote of the people. That's what you see on your ballot every time you go vote, and there's all those things. And so it basically, if it's in the Constitution, to change it, the people have to vote on it, and 2/3 of the legislature. The other thing is too, so if it's in the statute, the governor signs it, right? Or the governor can veto it. So you basically have to get the legislature and the governor to agree that it's a good idea before it becomes the law.
So the idea is that once it's in the Constitution, it's there forever, unless you amend it.
Yeah, it's frozen. But we do amend things all the time. And
Right.
I mean, it really just makes for, there's fundamental things that should be in the Constitution, right? Homestead exemption, leave that in the Constitution. That's fine. Your free speech, freedom of the press, all that stuff.
Yeah, right.
Second Amendment, we need that in the Constitution. But, like the cigarette tax, that probably does not need to be in the Constitution. And currently that is in our Constitution, right?
Yeah,
and
that's
so,
crazy, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you want to change things, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to tie all that up.
By the way, this Louisiana Constitution is like the longest in the country, isn't it, or something?
Yeah, I think it's the second longest. I think Alabama maybe has a longer one.
Okay.
It's the only state with a longer one, but it is long, and we've actually rewritten the Constitution 11 times, I think. So we continuously are in pursuit of a better Constitution here in the state of Louisiana.
Is there a constitutional convention somewhere in our future that would try to simplify the entire Constitution?
So there was a proposal to do that. It didn't,
I know.
It didn't get through. But I think this is a significant step. I mean, this is a giant leap in the right direction, right? So, like I said, Article 7 is the longest article. It's the most amended article. And so we really took a very strategic look to make it better.
How long, I know you said you worked a year or whatever before we got to the Amendment 2 stage. This is really tedious work, isn't it, Richard, to go through this Constitution or go even this one article and try to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted so that it all comes out when you guys talk about it the way that you want it to come out.
Yes, it's very difficult. And I mean, and also is that every line in the Constitution almost has some kind of constituency that is like, whoa, why are you touching this, or why are you touching that? I mean, and so you have to go and talk to that group, or you have to go and, meet. I spent a lot of time with local governments around the state, because there's a lot of things that local governments are concerned about. And so I met with every police juror and every, mayor and every guy in the entire state to try and get them comfortable with it. So it really has been a significant undertaking to bring about this change. And I mean, I hope, people will I think respect that by voting yes on March 29th. But
well, we got like 3-4 minutes left here, I don't want to be redundant, but let's go through Amendment 2 again, just to kind of summarize it, so that folks that are listening or watching to this podcast are left with what this is all about. So kind of start, and it sounds silly, but start at the beginning again about what Amendment 2 is all about.
Sure. So it rewrites the revenue and taxation article of the Constitution. I think it makes fundamental changes to make the state successful going forward. I'm trying to rewrite instead of the last 50 years, we're going to have a much more positive 50 years going forward. And so it makes a bunch of different changes. It caps the maximum amount of income tax. It doubles the standard deduction for seniors. It puts a prohibition or a break on special interest tax breaks, requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature. It makes it harder to pass any kind of special interest tax break. It creates a government growth limit so that caps the recurring expenses of the state can't exceed population and inflation. Very important. We change a bunch of constitutional funds. We consolidate the savings accounts, almost triple the balance of our rainy day fund, so that will be one of the most funded in the country. Frees up money for infrastructure and other things that would otherwise go to some of these dedicated accounts. And then it pays off $2 billion of teachers' debt, teachers' retirement debt, in order to give the teachers a permanent pay raise. The other thing we didn't mention was that it also frees up about $86 million for higher education too. So that payment saves up another $86 million for higher ed. So there's a lot of positive things in the amendment. I think it's all things that have been recommended forever, and so it's great to, I think, have the opportunity for the people to vote on this. I mean, it's very rare. This is probably one of the most important votes you'll ever make in your life, as far as the impact that it will have directly on your life. The future of the state is really hanging in the balance on this amendment, and I encourage people to go read it. It's online. PAR Louisiana has a very good guide, so you can see kind of the pros and cons if you go to their website. But it's very important to vote on. I mean, I don't know that we'll have an election that's more important than this.
I think there's 3 other amendments that are on the ballot at the same time Amendment 2 is, but I mean, it feels like they kind of pale in comparison to the importance of this one.
Yes, I mean, this is probably the most significant change, at least since the 1974 Constitution. Maybe before that. I mean, maybe going back to Huey Long. So this is one of the most significant things we'll do for the future of the state.
I can tell you really support this, my friend.
I mean, it's a labor of love. I've spent the last at least probably 5 years of my life getting to this point to help the state be put the state on the right track. So
well, we hope you're successful. It sounds like it is the way to go for the state and make things positive for the future and create growth and allow individual citizens to flourish as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right. Richard Nelson, Louisiana's Revenue Secretary. He would like you to vote yes on Amendment 2 on March 29th. Thanks for watching this latest edition of the app, Architects, People, and Politics. You can catch it wherever you watch your podcasts and, of course, on all the KTBS digital platforms as well. Thanks for watching. Have a good one, everybody.